Why was she the only one no one seemed to notice at the gate? The man in the pressed navy suit breezed past the attendants with a smile, his briefcase gleaming. The family with 3 children was ushered ahead with patient, sympathetic glances. A young student clutched a warm passport and received a warm greeting. And then there was her, Elizabeth Brown, 28, sliding her modest black suitcase along polished airport tiles. A figure blurred into the scenery of Brussels International. She moved with a practiced quietness, almost invisible in her oversized cardigan and low ponytail. No one stared. No one lingered. She had designed it that way. The boarding line pushed forward, and Elizabeth stepped into the jet bridge. The hum of machinery, the faint smell of jet fuel, the nervous chatter of strangers. It was all ordinary, forgettable, exactly as she wanted. Her boarding pass had her in row 7, middle seat, a position chosen with the same calculation she brought to everything. Not too close to first class where eyes lingered. Not too far back where chaos bred restlessness. Close enough to leave quickly if needed. But anonymous, always anonymous. The Airbus cabin was alive with its pre-flight ritual. Businessmen opening laptops, parents corralling restless children. Students laughing too loudly about semesters abroad. Elizabeth slid into 7C, tucked her bag neatly beneath the seat, and pulled out her tablet along with a worn paperback novel. She sipped the lukewarm coffee she'd carried in, her hands steady, her face unremarkable. Around her, life pulsed, loud and vibrant. She remained a quiet shadow in the middle row. The flight attendants moved with efficient grace. Marie Dubois, the lead attendant, offered her the same perfunctory smile she'd given dozens before her. "Cream?" she asked without really looking, already reaching past to the next passenger. Elizabeth accepted the small gesture. Unnoticed, unimportant, it was always the same. Acknowledged, but not seen. The engines began to stir, their low vibration echoing. Beneath her feet, Captain James Morrison's voice soon followed over the intercom. Smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 447 to Vienna. We are expecting a smooth 3-hour journey under clear skies. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. A routine trip, another business assignment, another week buried in insurance audits and numbers that never told the real story of people's lives." Elizabeth's colleagues in Prague would barely register her absence. Some might notice her desk empty, but none would ask where she had gone. Dependable, accurate, but replaceable. That was how she existed in their minds. She turned to her tablet, scrolling through claim reports. Around her, the world was busy with conversations, ringing phones, children's complaints. She welcomed the anonymity, sinking deeper into it. She was an expert at fading into the background, but there was something she hadn't told them. Not her colleagues, not her neighbors in Prague, not even the people who once tried to train her. A different version of Elizabeth had existed once. One that bore a code name she no longer spoke aloud, a name that belonged to late nights in sterile training facilities, voices over radios, and simulations where the line between chaos and survival blurred too easily. She had buried that version years ago, choosing spreadsheets over sirens, safety over recognition. Now, she let the hum of the engine soothe her, convincing herself this was just another Tuesday. But in less than 2 hours, the illusion would shatter. Her childhood had been defined by the same invisibility she now carried into adulthood. Growing up in a Welsh village, Elizabeth had learned early that quietness was safer than drawing attention. Her parents, both teachers, loved her fiercely, but encouraged her to focus on academics rather than the spotlight. She excelled in mathematics, in patterns, in order. She was praised for her grades, applauded for her diligence, but never chosen for the stage. Never sought out for leadership, even at Cardiff University, where she graduated with honors in computer science. Her presence went unnoticed. Professors respected her work, but rarely invited her into the inner circles of research. She completed projects with precision, yet classmates passed her by in pursuit of louder, brighter personalities. She smiled at their successes, even when she recognized her quiet fingerprints on their victories. It wasn't bitterness that grew inside her. Not exactly. It was something quieter, a sediment of being overlooked, layering over the years. But in the summers, she had pursued something else, something no one knew, a specialized emergency response training program that operated at the edges of civilian recognition. Long days of simulations, nights spent learning how to keep calm when chaos roared. There, she had proven herself capable of analyzing crises, coordinating responses, speaking clearly when fear strangled others. She had been given a designation during those summers, a code name whispered in radios. Nightingale, a name for those who could maintain calm when voices broke. Yet when her training ended, she had been told she lacked one crucial quality: presence. "You're brilliant." Elizabeth, her instructor, Dr. Patricia Hayes, had said, "You can process information under impossible pressure. You can communicate with clarity when others panic, but you don't command a room. You don't have the kind of presence people instinctively follow." And so the door had closed. Elizabeth had walked away, telling herself it was for the best. She had buried Nightingale beneath the folds of an ordinary life. Insurance work was safe, predictable. No one expected her to lead. No one asked her to save lives. She built her world carefully. A small apartment in Prague filled with books and files, a modest collection of certifications tucked into a folder. Like old photographs, she never spoke of them, she never tried again, and yet she never let go. Evenings were spent studying crisis psychology manuals, aircraft safety protocols, languages that could break barriers in emergencies. She practiced communication drills alone in her apartment, voice steady, instructions precise. She stocked medical supplies that went beyond aspirin and bandages, replacing them before expiration. She read aviation reports like novels, memorizing where exits lay, how systems failed, how lives could be saved if someone simply knew what to do. She told herself it was a hobby, a private reassurance, nothing more. The plane leveled at 37,000 feet. Elizabeth took a slow sip of coffee. To anyone watching, she was another unremarkable passenger heading to Vienna for work. To herself, she was a woman who had spent years preparing for a moment that might never come. The businessman in 7 shifted loudly, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke about quarterly projections. The woman in 7B slept with her head tilted uncomfortably against the window, every so often brushing Elizabeth's elbow. The scene was ordinary, forgettable, but inside, Elizabeth felt that familiar ache, the quiet knowledge that her life was made of preparation without recognition, of skills kept sharp in the dark. She had accepted that no one would ever see her, and yet, high above the quiet Austrian Alps, where the clouds looked soft and harmless, there waited a moment that would demand everything she had hidden, a moment when her name would no longer be invisible. But for now, she stared out the window, tracing the horizon with tired eyes, convincing herself it would be the most forgettable flight of her life. She had no idea that in less than an hour, the pilot would whisper her code name, and 312 lives would hang on whether the quiet woman in row 7 was willing to be invisible no longer. What makes a plane lurch like that, when the sky outside looks so impossibly calm? It wasn't violent, not at first, just a sudden dip, the kind that makes your stomach turn weightless before settling again. A ripple of unease moved through the cabin, nervous laughter, a child's sharp cry. The businessman beside her muttered into his phone, annoyed. To anyone else, it was turbulence. To Elizabeth, it was something else. Her body stiffened, trained instinct taking over even as her mind tried to deny it. She glanced out the window. The horizon tilted and corrected. Too sharp, too sudden. She pressed her coffee cup against the tray, steadying it with both hands. Her pulse ticked higher, though her expression stayed unreadable. The intercom crackled. Captain Morrison's voice came through, smooth but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Nothing to be concerned about." But Elizabeth heard what others didn't. That catch, that edge in his tone. He was buying them calm, buying time. The engines roared unevenly. Her eyes darted. Left, a thin gray smear of smoke trailed past the wing, faint but there. She knew what it meant. She had studied this. She had rehearsed it in her small Prague apartment. Alone at midnight while the city slept, she closed her tablet, her mind racing. Engine failure. Possibly hydraulics. If the control systems were compromised, the pilots were fighting more than turbulence. The cabin didn't know yet. Not really, passengers whispered, glanced around nervously, then returned to their distractions. A woman across the aisle crossed herself. A young man laughed too loudly, masking fear. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. This was the moment. The very scenario she had imagined countless times while sitting in cramped classrooms with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Simulations where panic spread faster than fire. She remembered the instructors saying it again and again. Emergencies don't announce themselves. They creep in slowly, and if you wait too long, the panic takes over. Her hands gripped the armrests. She told herself to stay invisible, to let the crew handle it. That was what normal passengers did. That was the role she had built her life around. But already she could see the cracks forming. The businessman in 7A had ended his call and was now gripping the seat back in front of him. His face pale. The sleeping woman in 7B stirred awake, confused by the sudden dip. Children began to cry, their parents shushing them with voices that trembled. Elizabeth knew what was coming. Not just mechanical failure, human failure, panic, disorder, and still, no one looked at her. Marie and the other attendants moved quickly through the aisles. Professional smiles strained at the edges. Seatbelts fastened. Remain calm. They avoided showing fear, but Elizabeth, trained to read stress markers, could see it in the tremor of Marie's hands, the clipped tone of her voice. Another jolt. This one harder. The oxygen masks above their heads rattled but didn't fall. A scream pierced the cabin. The businessman cursed under his breath. His composure cracking, Elizabeth's mind raced. Smoke from the left engine. Erratic control responses. Altitude still stable. For now, but over the Alps, options were limited. Few places to land. Rescue would be difficult. She pressed her palms together, trying to ground herself. She had been here before. Not in the air. Not with 312 souls trapped in a metal fuselage, but in the simulated chaos of training camps. Rooms filled with noise, lights, people pretending to panic, and she had been the one to steady them. To take a breath when everyone else forgot how. But she wasn't Nightingale anymore. That name had been buried. That part of her was dead, wasn't it? Her chest tightened. She could almost hear Dr. Hayes again. "You have the skill, Elizabeth, but you don't have the presence. People won't follow you." Another tremor through the plane. Another scream. Laptops slid from tray tables. Cups toppled. The calm was thinning, shredding into something darker. Elizabeth's eyes swept the cabin. She saw it happening. Panic blooming like fire in dry grass. The man in 7A now hyperventilating. The woman in 7B clutching her phone. Passengers whispering too loudly. Voices rising. Marie appeared at their row, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger, offering the same strained reassurance. It's under control. But Elizabeth could see her scanning faster than she could process, her breathing uneven. She was approaching overload. Elizabeth had studied it, the point at which responders themselves became liabilities. It was happening right in front of her. Elizabeth sat perfectly still, her mind warring with itself. Stay quiet, stay invisible. That had always been her survival, but another voice pushed back. If you don't, no one else will. The aircraft groaned, a terrible grinding sound beneath them. The woman in 7B cried openly now, Children sobbed. The businessman clutched his armrests tightly, his knuckles whitened. Elizabeth's eyes closed briefly. Every buried hour of training, every simulation, every sleepless night she had wondered. If she had wasted her life, it was all pressing against her ribcage. The whisper came again, not in her voice, in memory, in radio static from years ago. "Nightingale, you're clear. Keep the channel calm." Her eyes opened. Her decision had not yet formed, but her body already knew. Then came the words that would change everything. The intercom crackled once more. This time not smooth, not rehearsed. The captain's voice broke through the cabin with urgency, a tremor of desperation leaking through. "Elizabeth, we need Nightingale now." For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The name hung in the air like smoke, foreign to every ear but hers. Passengers looked at each other in confusion. A murmur rippled. Who was Elizabeth? What was Nightingale? Elizabeth froze, her stomach twisting. The captain knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Her cover of invisibility evaporated in a breath. All eyes in row 7 turned toward her. The quiet woman no one had noticed, the one who had blended so carefully. Into the background, her secret life was no longer secret. The cabin waited, bewildered, afraid, desperate for an answer. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She could feel every eye pressing against her skin, demanding to know. Was it true? Was the woman they had ignored their only chance to survive? Why was everyone staring at her? It was the question Elizabeth had spent her entire life avoiding, and now it hung over her like a spotlight. Row 7 had gone still. The businessman's frantic breathing slowed as he turned his head. The woman at the window wiped tears from her cheeks, her eyes narrowing as if she'd misheard. Across the aisle, a teenage boy whispered, "Did he say Elizabeth?" And the word Nightingale rippled through the cabin like a rumor trying to take shape. Her name, her code name, spoken aloud by the captain. Elizabeth's mouth went dry. She gripped the armrests, pulse racing, the metal tube around. Them shuddered again, jolting passengers back into panic. A baby wailed. Someone prayed in German. Marie hurried forward, barking instructions to secure loose items. But the eyes came back, always back to her. Elizabeth had spent years mastering invisibility, wrapping herself in quietness like armor. She knew how to slip through crowds without drawing attention, how to nod politely in meetings until her voice was forgotten, how to become a shadow at the edges of other people's stories. That invisibility had been her protection, her survival, and now, torn away in a single sentence. Nightingale. Her throat tightened at the sound of it. She hadn't heard the name in years. It didn't belong here, not in this cabin, not among strangers who only saw her as the quiet woman in 7C. That name belonged to another life, another version of herself, but the pilot had said it for a reason. Another tremor rattled the aircraft. The lights flickered. Luggage thudded overhead. This wasn't turbulence anymore. It was survival time. Elizabeth's training screamed inside her, recognized the threat, managed the panic, stabilized the group. She could see the signs, passengers unraveling, the crew pushed to their limits, the narrow thread of order fraying with every second. Her rational mind fought back. Stay seated. Let the professionals handle it. You'll embarrass yourself. You'll fail in front of everyone, just like they always said. But then her eyes landed on the businessman in 7A. His lips were pale, his chest heaving too fast. She knew the signs. Hyperventilation tipping into shock. One wrong word from someone near him, one scream too loud, and his panic would spread like wildfire. The woman in 7B was scrolling her phone with trembling hands, trying and failing to call her family, whispering, "Please, please, please." Children cried without comfort because their parents had nothing left to give them but fear. Elizabeth felt her heartbeat in her ears. She could stay quiet. She could let the cabin slide further into chaos until the crew's voices were drowned out, or She could become the very thing she had been told she could never be. She inhaled slowly, one breath, then another. Her pulse slowed, steadied. She thought of those long training nights when instructors cranked alarms and flashing lights until the room dissolved into panic. She thought of how her voice, steady, measured, had cut through it, not loud, not commanding, just calm, clear, and people had listened. She rose from her seat. The simple movement drew a ripple through those around her. Heads turned, eyes sharpened. A few voices whispered, "Is it her?" "What's happening?" Marie, the attendant, caught her eye. For a moment, Elizabeth saw both fear and hope collide in the woman's expression, as if begging for someone to step forward. Anyone. Elizabeth's knees trembled, but her voice came. Before doubt could stop it. "I can help." 3 words, spoken quietly, but with a calm that cut through the surrounding panic. Marie blinked, then leaned closer, her voice low, urgent. "What kind of help?" Elizabeth swallowed. The old instinct rose in her chest like a tide. The voice she had practiced in an empty apartment. The protocol she had memorized for scenarios that never came. They were all here now, pressing against her ribs. Emergency. Response. Crisis coordination. The words surprised her with their steadiness. "I'm trained for this." Marie hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. Her training said passengers weren't to intervene, but her eyes, scanning the chaos around them, understood what regulations could not. This wasn't a normal emergency. This was spiraling into something far beyond their control. "Come with me." Elizabeth followed her toward the galley, weaving through rows where passengers clutched each other, muttered prayers, demanded answers. She kept her chin level, her eyes scanning like she had been trained, noting who was calm, who was fragile, who might break first. At the front, the senior attendant, Robert, was trying to maintain order. Among his team, his face tightened when he saw Elizabeth. "Who's this?" "She says she's trained," Marie said, breathless. "And the captain." He called her name. Robert's eyes narrowed, skeptical, protective. He started to shake his head. But Elizabeth spoke before he could dismiss her. "Your crew needs to focus on procedures and safety checks. The passengers are destabilizing. If panic takes over, it will compromise everything." Her voice was calm, precise, carrying the weight of someone who knew. "I can stabilize them. That's my training, mass casualty coordination, crisis psychology." Robert stared at her, torn between regulation and desperation. His jaw flexed. The cabin behind them shook with another metallic groan, followed by a chorus of frightened voices. He made his choice. "What do you need?" Elizabeth's answer came without hesitation. "The intercom." A silence hung in the small galley. The request was outrageous. No passenger was ever given the aircraft's voice. It was against protocol, against regulation. But protocol wasn't saving anyone now. Robert exhaled, then shoved the handset toward her. "Don't make me regret this." Elizabeth's fingers closed around the plastic grip. It was lighter than she expected. She lifted it to her mouth. A reflection staring back in the dark window beyond the galley. A woman who had spent her life invisible, about to speak so that 300 people would hear her. Her chest tightened once more. The old doubt clawed at her. "They won't." "Listen, you don't command respect. You'll fail." But then she remembered the words of her instructor. Words meant to dismiss her, but now refrained as strength. "You don't have presence." She didn't need presence. She had preparation. She had calm. She had a voice built not to dominate, but to steady. Elizabeth pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone low, steady, carrying into every corner of the cabin. "This is Elizabeth Brown. I've had emergency response training. I will be helping coordinate our safety procedures. I need everyone to listen carefully and follow instructions exactly." The cabin noise softened. Not silence, not yet, but softer. A pause. People glanced upward, toward the speakers, then toward her. The businessman in 7, and blinked in disbelief. The woman in 7B lowered her phone, her hands trembling. Children hiccuped through tears, but quieted enough to hear. Elizabeth's own heart pounded, but her voice did not waver. "We are going to get through this, but only if we stay calm. Only if we listen. So take a deep breath right now. Do it with me." A pause, a beat, and then, unbelievably, people obeyed. Hundreds of lungs filled together, a shaky inhale that drew them into her rhythm. For the first time, Elizabeth felt the cabin shift away from chaos toward her. It was beginning, and deep in her chest, buried beneath years of invisibility, the nightingale was stirring awake. Why did her voice sound stronger than she felt? Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she lowered the intercom, but the cabin didn't see it. What they heard was calm authority, something they desperately needed to cling to. A hush rippled through the rows. For the first time since the plane had jolted, passengers weren't shouting over one another. They were waiting. The aircraft shuddered again. Dipping sharply before leveling, a baby wailed. A man cursed under his breath, but the difference was unmistakable. The noise of panic had dulled into anxious silence. Elizabeth inhaled slowly, steadying herself. This was the moment. She either proved her voice could hold them together, or they would collapse into chaos. She pressed the intercom again. "First, check your seatbelts right now. Pull them tight. They will save your life." Around the cabin, clicks and metallic snaps echoed as passengers obeyed. Flight attendants moved quickly to assist, their eyes flicking toward Elizabeth with something close to disbelief. Already, the crowd was responding more to her than to them. "Next," Elizabeth continued, "remove anything sharp from your pockets, pens, keys, glasses. Place them in the seat pocket in front of you. You don't want loose objects to injure you on impact." Hands moved. Objects clattered in the pockets. The businessman in 7A, still pale, obeyed without hesitation. The woman in 7B followed, breathing fast but steady now. Even children were mimicking adults, emptying their hands. Elizabeth's heart pounded. She remembered the drills. Keep it simple. Keep it specific. Panic thrives on uncertainty. Calm thrives on clear steps. She looked up. Marie was staring at her. Not skeptical now, awed. Elizabeth gave the flight attendant a small nod, then pressed the button again. "If you are seated in an exit row, I need you to check the instructions. Right now, read them carefully. If you do not feel capable of opening that door in an emergency, raise your hand so a flight attendant can reseat you." Gasps and whispers flickered across the rows. But then hands rose. A man in his 70s, a teenage girl, a nervous-looking woman. Elizabeth pointed quickly, gesturing Marie and Robert to swap them with stronger, steadier passengers. She moved with clarity, no hesitation, her voice carrying like a rope pulling them all together. The aircraft groaned beneath them. Another sickening dip. The lights flickered. A scream erupted near the back, but quickly died as people looked toward the speakers, waiting for Elizabeth to speak again. This was working. Elizabeth's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. This was what she had been preparing for all along. Not the spreadsheets, not the forgotten office parties, not the polite dismissals. But doubt whispered even now. What if it isn't enough? What if they crash and it's all for nothing? She crushed the thought. Focus, one step at a time. She turned toward the attendants. "I need volunteers identified." "Medical training, military, emergency response?" Robert blinked, startled, but Ben raised his voice. "If you have relevant training, stand now." A ripple moved through the cabin. A young woman in athletic gear lifted her hand. Nursing student, a man in his 40s stood stiffly. Army Reserves. Another. Paramedic. Elizabeth pointed. "Spread out. Position yourselves in different sections. You'll assist those who need help evacuating." They obeyed, moving with a speed that calmed those around them. The passengers were watching something rare. Strangers being shaped into a team by a voice they'd ignored. Until today, Elizabeth glanced toward the back rows. She saw a mother struggling to soothe two children, her hands shaking too badly to secure their seatbelts. Elizabeth gestured to one of the volunteers. "Assist her." The man nodded. Moving quickly, she scanned again. A woman clutched her rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. Another passenger rocked back and forth, whispering to himself in a language Elizabeth barely recognized. Slavic, she thought. Without hesitation, she called out in basic phrases she had practiced late at night. Short, direct, reassuring. His eyes snapped up, relief flooding his expression at hearing his own tongue. Passengers who had once overlooked her now stared with astonishment. The quiet woman in 7C, the one they hadn't noticed boarding, the one no flight attendant had singled out, was the one giving them structure, saving them from collapse. The aircraft jolted violently again. Worse this time. A metallic screech tore through the cabin, followed by the acrid scent of smoke. Seeping faintly into the air, people cried out. Panic surged. Elizabeth slammed her thumb against the intercom. "Listen to me. Everyone breathe in and out." Her voice cut through the rising screams. "We are staying calm. We are staying focused. You are not alone. We are doing this together." Miraculously, people obeyed. Not everyone, but enough. The ripple of panic dulled again, replaced by the rhythm of shared breathing. Behind her, Marie whispered, "How are you doing this?" Elizabeth's answer was quiet, but her eyes were steady. "I trained for this. I just never thought I'd use it." The intercom crackled again. This time, it wasn't Elizabeth. It was the cockpit. Captain Morrison's voice was raw, urgent, stripped of all practiced calm. "Cabin crew, we have multiple system failures. Prepare for an emergency landing. Time to impact uncertain. Repeat, uncertain." The words struck like a thunderclap. Passengers gasped, cried out. The word impact spread down the rows like a curse. Elizabeth closed her eyes for half a second. Then she pressed the button again, cutting through the chaos. "Listen to me. We are going to prepare. I will guide you step by step. This position can save your life, but only if you follow exactly." She demonstrated with her own body, leaning forward, hands over her head, voice firm, feet flat bend. Forward, hands protecting your head and neck. "Do it now." The cabin bent with her, rows of bodies folding into the brace position, guided not by flight attendants, not by pilots, but by the quiet woman they had once ignored. Elizabeth looked down the length of the plane, heart hammering. For the first time in her life, 300 people weren't overlooking her. They were depending on her, and she could not fail them. The aircraft dipped again, engines roaring, smoke thickening in the air, lights flickered. The ground was coming faster than anyone wanted to admit. Elizabeth gripped the intercom, her knuckles white. "Stay with me," she said softly. The words, more prayer than instruction. "Stay with me, and we'll make it through." What does the final descent sound like? It wasn't silence. It wasn't screaming. It was something in between. The tortured groan of metal straining against forces it wasn't built to endure, mixed with 100 stifled sobs pressed into shirt sleeves. The whispered prayers of strangers clinging to hope. Elizabeth gripped the intercom as the plane jolted again, her voice slicing through the tremor in the air. "Hold your position, feet flat, head down, hands over your head. Stay there." Her own body folded forward, every muscle taut with both fear and control. Around her, rows of passengers mirrored the stance, their movements imperfect but earnest. The businessman in 7A obeyed with trembling hands. The woman in 7B, who minutes ago had been paralyzed by panic, pressed herself against the seat back in front of her. Elizabeth scanned quickly. Not everyone was braced. A child peeked up, whimpering. A teenager fumbled with his belt. Elizabeth lifted her head just enough, her voice sharper now. "You. Eyes down. Belt tight. Do it now." The authority in her tone left no space for doubt. They obeyed. The flight attendants were strapped into their jump seats, but even from there, they glanced at Elizabeth, their eyes wide with disbelief. She wasn't just steadying the passengers. She was steadying them too. The cabin lights flickered again. Then, for one terrible moment, they went out. Darkness. Gasps erupted. Someone screamed. The sound of crying surged again. Elizabeth's voice filled the void. "Stay calm. Darkness changes nothing. You are safe if you stay in position." The emergency lights blinked on seconds later, dim and red, casting the cabin in a haunting glow. The passengers were shadows now, hunched figures trembling in silence. Through the intercom, Captain Morrison's voice cracked with static. "Brace for landing. Impact in 3 minutes. 3 minutes." Elizabeth forced herself to inhale slowly, counting the rhythm in her mind. 3 minutes wasn't time for speeches. It was time for survival. "Listen to me," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin, firm but steady. "When we land, do not unbuckle until you hear me say so. Do not stand. Do not grab your bags. Nothing matters but getting off this aircraft alive. When I give the word, move quickly, but do not run. Running creates chaos. Help those near you. Do not look back." The words came without hesitation, each one pulled from years of study, repetition, late nights whispering protocols into empty rooms. Now, for the first time, the world was listening. Elizabeth glanced to her right. The businessman in 7A had closed his eyes, his lips moving silently. A prayer, maybe. The woman in 7B clutched the hem of her skirt, knuckles white. Elizabeth wanted to tell them both it would be okay, but truth mattered here too. She pressed the intercom. "Impact will be hard, but you are ready. You will survive this if you hold your position." The aircraft dipped violently. Loose items rattled. Luggage thudded overhead. The smell of smoke thickened, burning into their throats. Someone coughed loudly. Another passenger shouted, "We're going to die." Elizabeth's voice cut back, stronger than she believed possible. "No, we are going to live. Stay in position, together." The word "together" echoed through the cabin. It wasn't a promise. It was an anchor. The ground rushed closer. Elizabeth didn't need to see it. She could feel the descent in the pit of her stomach. The whine of the engines shifted, the desperate roar of reverse thrust screaming against physics. The cabin tilted left, then right, then steadied for a breathless instant. Then came the impact. A bone-jarring crash that slammed Elizabeth into her seatbelt, her forehead brushing the seat back in front of her despite her brace. Screams tore through the cabin as the aircraft shuddered, sparks visible through the windows as metal met tarmac. The grinding roar was deafening. Seats rattled, overhead bins burst open, spilling bags that thudded and tumbled through the aisles. The fuselage skidded sideways, screeching across concrete. A window cracked with a spiderweb fracture. Oxygen masks swung wildly, unused, like pendulums. Elizabeth forced her stay, folded forward, arms locked over her head. The instinct to look up, to see what was happening, clawed at her. But training held her down, her voice, muffled against her arms, pressed into the intercom still clutched in her hand. "Stay down, hold, do not move." The plane jolted again, veering sharply left. Passengers screamed as the world tilted. For one heart-stopping second, it felt like the aircraft might roll. But then, a final shudder. A lurch and stillness, silence. It was the loudest silence Elizabeth had ever heard. For 3 endless seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. Then sobs erupted, choked laughter, voices calling names. Elizabeth lifted her head slowly. Her ears rang. Her chest hurt from the belt's force, but she was alive. They were alive. Through the window, she saw fire trucks racing toward them. Red and blue lights flickering against the broken body of the aircraft. Smoke curled from the left engine, rising against the gray sky. She pressed the intercom again, her voice hoarse but steady. Everyone remained seated. Listen carefully. We are beginning evacuation. Do not unbuckle until I give the word. The attendants, freed from their restraints, looked at her with something between shock and reverence. Robert's voice broke as he said, "What now?" Elizabeth inhaled once more, forcing her trembling hands to still. "Now we get them out? Fast, controlled, no panic." She turned back to the intercom, her voice filling the cabin once more. "When I give the word, exit rows, open doors. Volunteers assist the injured. Parents, hold your children tight. Move quickly, but do not push. Once outside, keep moving away from the aircraft. Do not stop. Do not look back." She looked down the aisle, 300 eyes fixed on her, waiting. "Exit row. Stand by," she commanded, her voice steadier. Then she felt, outside, the emergency crews drew closer, inside. The passengers who had once ignored her sat braced, trembling, but ready. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the intercom. This was it, the moment between survival and disaster. The moment she had trained for in silence, never believing it would come. And now, 300 lives hung on her next word. What happens in the seconds after survival? The cabin wasn't cheering, it wasn't celebrating, it was trembling. Hundreds of bodies locked in shock, lungs gasping for air that smelled of smoke and burning oil. The plane sat broken on the runway, metal grinding into silence, but the danger wasn't over, not even close. Elizabeth pressed the intercom, her voice steady, deliberate. "Everyone stay seated. Remain calm. We will evacuate in order. Listen for my instructions." Her chest ached, her throat was raw, but her voice cut through the chaos like a light. Through fog, the passengers froze, waiting. The trust in their eyes startled her. Minutes ago, they hadn't seen her at all. Now, every life in the cabin seemed tied to her next breath. She met Marie's eyes. The flight attendant gave her a tiny nod, a signal of trust, of surrender. Robert, still strapped near the forward galley, unbuckled, his face pale but focused. Elizabeth raised the intercom again. "Exit rows, prepare doors. Do not open until I give the word." The aircraft shuddered slightly, a metallic groan vibrating through the floor. The left engine still smoked, heat radiating off the wing. Through a small gap at the window, Elizabeth saw fire crews pulling hoses into position. They're flashing. Lights painted the interior in red and blue. She could feel panic ready to ignite. Every second mattered. "Brace is over," she commanded. "Unbuckle now, stand by, but stay calm." Seatbelts clicked open across the cabin. The sound was like rainfall. Passengers sat upright, trembling, clutching armrests in each other. A child whimpered, his mother holding him so tightly Elizabeth worried she might hurt him. Elizabeth's voice sharpened, anchoring them. "Leave everything behind, bags stay here. Nothing matters but your life." A murmur rippled, but no one moved to grab overhead luggage. Her clarity, her insistence, had already rewired them. She turned to the attendants. "Check conditions outside." Marie ran to the forward exit, peered through the small porthole. "Clear," she shouted. "Rescue crews in position." Robert checked the opposite side. "Smoke on the left, right side only." Elizabeth nodded. "Forward exits first. Open now." The doors blew outward with a mechanical hiss. Inflatable slides roared into shape, white fabric unfurling like lifelines against the gray sky. Cool air rushed into the cabin, sweeping away the acrid smoke. For a split second, passengers stared in disbelief at the escape routes. Elizabeth's voice surged back, urgent, commanding. "Go!" Forward rows first. Move quickly, but do not push. Volunteers, assist children and elderly. Keep the line moving. The first passengers launched themselves down the slide, a businessman clutching his shoes, a young woman sobbing into her hands, a boy clinging to his father. They tumbled to the ground below, caught by firefighters waiting at the base. Inside, Panic tried to rise again. A man in row 10 shouted, "Move! Move!" Shoving the seat in front of him, the ripple of fear spread down the aisle. Elizabeth stepped into the middle, her voice cutting sharp as steel. "Stop. We do not shove. We move together or people die." Her tone froze him. The ripple stalled. Passengers blinked at her, stunned by the sudden force in her voice. Then slowly they obeyed. The line flowed again. Elizabeth moved down the aisle as the evacuation accelerated. She gestured volunteers to help the elderly, pointed toward mothers with infants, called out instructions in different languages: German, French, Italian. Broken but effective, each phrase steadied another cluster of frightened passengers. Unlocking movement where paralysis threatened, she reached a woman in her 60s, struggling with her belt. "Hands here," Elizabeth said gently, guiding trembling fingers. The belt clicked open. "Now go. Straight down the slide. Do not look back." The woman nodded, tears streaking her cheeks, and vanished into the flow. Elizabeth turned back to the intercom. Middle rows. Now. "Move! Move!" The slide absorbed bodies in waves. Children shrieked as they dropped. Parents scrambling after them. Volunteers held hands, steadying strangers as they leapt into the unknown. The cabin was thinning, but not fast enough. Smoke thickened, curling. From the rear, somewhere, metal popped loudly, making passengers flinch. The smell of burning plastic tightened throats. Robert shouted, "Rear exit blocked." Elizabeth's heart slammed. That meant all 312 had to funnel through fewer doors. The risk of panic skyrocketed. She forced her voice calm. "Focus forward. Keep moving. We are almost there." Her chest ached. Her arms burned from guiding passengers. But she didn't stop. Not until the aisles were nearly empty. She reached the back rows. A teenage boy sat frozen, shaking his head violently. I can't go." Elizabeth crouched, locking eyes with him. Her voice softened. "Yes, you can. You don't have to be brave. You just have to move. I'll go with you." She took his hand, pulling gently but firmly. He rose, sobbing, and she guided him step by step until Marie took him at the door, launching him down the slide. The rows were emptying fast now. The roar of engines outside was drowned by the rush of feet and the shouts of firefighters. Elizabeth moved aisle to aisle, checking for anyone. Left behind, a man slumped unconscious near row 14. She grabbed a volunteer, together dragging him toward the exit. 2 firefighters reached in, pulling him out with practiced speed. Finally, the cabin fell into eerie quiet. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the plane, chest heaving, smoke biting her lungs. The seats were empty, the aisles clear. Robert shouted from the front, "We have to go." Elizabeth's legs trembled. For the first time, she realized how close she'd come to collapse, but she forced herself forward. She would not leave until she was certain. Row by row, she scanned. No one. Only then did she allow herself to move. Toward the slide, she turned once, looking back at the cabin that had nearly become their tomb. Her chest clenched with something sharp. Not fear, not relief, but the weight of what had just happened. The invisibility she'd carried her whole. Life had shattered. Elizabeth climbed onto the slide, pushing off into the cool air. Gravity seized her, rushing her down into the arms of waiting firefighters. She stumbled onto the tarmac, knees weak, lungs burning, and then she saw them. 300 people, huddled together, coughing, crying, clutching each other, but alive, every single one. Her body shook, her throat closed. She had no words, no breath, no way to hold the enormity of it. The passengers who had once overlooked her now turned, their eyes fixed on her, their voices breaking into something like gratitude, like awe. Elizabeth Brown, the woman no one had noticed in row 7, had led them all out. What does survival feel like when the silence finally comes? Elizabeth stood on the tarmac, her knees weak, her breath catching in her chest. Around her, hundreds of voices collided. Children crying into their mothers' shoulders, men shouting names into the crowd, women sobbing with relief so violent it almost sounded like pain. Fire trucks roared past, their hoses spraying arcs of foam onto the wounded aircraft. The acrid smoke clung to her skin, sharp in her nostrils. Yet the cold air tasted sweeter than anything she had ever known. She was alive. They were alive. But she couldn't move, not yet. Her eyes swept over the cluster of passengers gathered by the rescue vehicles. She counted instinctively, 10s, 20s. Not for herself, for them. She needed the number, needed proof that the impossible had happened, all accounted for. Her throat tightened, her body trembled, finally acknowledging the strain. It had been holding back, but she forced herself upright, scanning, steadying. Even now, after the impact, after the smoke, her instinct was still to lead. "Are you hurt?" a firefighter asked, reaching for her arm. She shook her head, unable to form words. Captain Morrison appeared through the haze, his uniform torn, his face lined with exhaustion. He walked straight to her, eyes fixed as if she were the only person. Left on the tarmac, when he reached her, he extended his hand. "Miss Brown," he said, his voice raw, "you saved lives today, more than you know." Elizabeth stared at him, unsure what to say. Words felt too small. She finally managed a whisper. I just did what I could." The captain shook his head. "No, you did more. Without you, we wouldn't have kept control in that cabin. I've flown for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it." First Officer Sarah Chun joined him, her eyes glassy but steady. "We heard you through the intercom," she said softly. "You held them together. Do you understand what that means? We were flying half-blind up there, and if the passengers had panicked—" She shook her head. "It doesn't bear imagining." Elizabeth looked away, her chest tight. She didn't want to imagine it either. Marie appeared next, her hair disheveled, uniform stained, but her eyes fierce with gratitude. She gripped Elizabeth's shoulders. "You kept them alive. You kept us alive." Elizabeth shook her head again. I trained. I knew what to do. Trained." Robert's voice came from behind. He stepped closer, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and suspicion. "What kind of training does an insurance analyst have that makes her sound like a crisis commander?" Elizabeth froze, her throat tightened. The truth she had buried for years hovered on the edge of her tongue. But before she could answer, flashing lights and uniformed officials approached. "Passengers, this way please," an Austrian airport officer called. Ushering the group toward waiting buses, ambulances lined the edge of the runway. Medics moving swiftly among survivors, checking pulses, wrapping blankets around shaking shoulders. Elizabeth let herself be guided into the flow, her body heavy, her mind spinning. She felt like a ghost drifting among the living. Every few steps, someone touched her arm, whispered thank you, clutched her hand. Strangers who hours ago hadn't even looked at her now looked at her as if she had carried them out of fire. And in a way, she had. Inside the terminal, chaos reigned. News cameras were already forming at the edges, drawn by reports of a miracle landing. Medical personnel triaged passengers, separating the injured from the unscathed. Investigators conferred in tight clusters, their voices sharp, their eyes scanning for answers. Elizabeth tried to disappear again, to fold into the crowd, but it was too late. "Miss Brown?" The voice pulled her back. A man in a dark suit, his badge visible, stood waiting. His expression was polite but firm. "I'm Inspector Wolfgang Muller, Austrian Aviation Authority. We need to speak with you." Elizabeth's breath caught. She glanced at the captain, at Marie, at the passengers still clustered in shock. But Muller's gaze didn't waver. He already knew she wasn't just another passenger. They led her into a small conference room off the terminal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The walls sterile white. Elizabeth sat at a table, her cardigan still smelling faintly of smoke. Across from her, Inspector Muller opened a folder. According to the manifest, You're an insurance data analyst. From Prague, he began, his tone measured. But reports from the crew and multiple passengers say you coordinated the evacuation, issued safety instructions, even organized volunteers. That is unusual. Elizabeth clasped her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. She said nothing. Muller leaned forward. The captain himself used your name, Nightingale. He seemed to expect you. Why? Her stomach turned. She had hidden that part of her life for so long. To speak it aloud now felt like stripping away skin. But the silence stretched, and she knew hiding was no longer possible. I had emergency response training, she said finally, her voice low but steady. Years ago. It was never official work. I kept it private, but I stayed current. Mahler's brow furrowed. Private training? That does not explain what you did today. Elizabeth hesitated, then exhaled slowly. She thought of the countless hours in that dim Prague apartment, drilling herself on manuals, memorizing procedures no one had asked her to learn. She thought of the summers in sterile classrooms, radios pressed to her ear, instructors shouting over simulated chaos. She thought of the name she had sworn she would never use again. My designation was Nightingale, she whispered. It was a code name for coordinators trained to maintain calm communication in multi-casualty events. Mahler's pen stilled on the page. His eyes lifted, sharp with disbelief and something else. Respect. You mean to tell me, he said slowly, that a passenger, a so-called data analyst, just conducted one of the most successful mass evacuations in modern aviation history. Because she once trained in secret. Elizabeth's hands clenched tighter in her lap. Because I never stopped preparing, she said. The room went silent. Outside the door, reporters shouted questions. Passengers wept into the arms of their families. Fire crews rolled equipment back toward their trucks, and Elizabeth sat beneath the sterile lights, realizing that the life she had hidden behind quietness was no longer hers to keep. The world had seen her. Why does the world only see you after the fire? Elizabeth asked herself that question months later, sitting alone on her balcony in Prague. The city spread out below her in twilight, the Vltava catching the last light of day, trams rattling across. The bridges, the world had moved on, but she hadn't, not entirely. Her name was no longer anonymous, not after Vienna, not after the runway. The smoke, the evacuation, she had tried to return to invisibility, tried to sit in her small office, crunching numbers, nodding at meetings where her voice was never asked for. But it was impossible now. Her coworkers glanced at her differently. Strangers whispered in elevators. News articles used her photo without permission. Elizabeth Brown, the nobody from row 7, the quiet woman who had spoken 300 people into survival. She hated the headlines. They twisted the truth into something loud, heroic, cinematic. They never understood the reality, how afraid she had been, how close she had come to breaking. They didn't see the way her hands shook when the intercom first touched her palm, or the nightmares that woke her still, engines screaming in her sleep. But she also knew the passengers remembered it differently. Weeks after the crash, letters began arriving. Handwritten notes, emails, packages. Strangers she had guided off that plane found her, one by one. A mother from row 19 sent her a crayon drawing, scrolled by her daughter, a stick figure holding hands with dozens of others. Beneath it, in block letters, the child had written, "You saved us." The businessman from Savannah wrote a single line, "You steadied me when I was breaking." I will never forget. The teenage boy who had frozen in the back row sent her a long message. He confessed that he had thought he would die that day, until she knelt beside him, her voice soft, promising she'd go with him. "You made me believe I could move," he wrote. "I've never had anyone do that for me before." Elizabeth kept every letter, not because she wanted to be remembered, but because they reminded her that what had happened mattered, that all the quiet years of study, all The nights of invisibility had not been wasted. Still, she struggled with what it meant. Was she Nightingale again? Was she supposed to become something larger, louder, visible in ways she had never been comfortable with? She didn't know. One afternoon, Captain Morrison called her. His voice was steady now, recovered, but edged with gratitude. "Elizabeth," he said, "the investigators are writing the reports. They'll name you in them. You need to be prepared for that." Elizabeth closed her eyes. She didn't want her name in reports, in headlines, in history books. She wanted her life back, her anonymity. But then Morrison said something else, something softer. "It's not about what they'll write. It's about what you did. You turned chaos into calm. You did what we couldn't. That's not something to hide from." She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure she could. In the months that followed, she lived quietly. The world buzzed for a while, then moved on to the next story. Only those who had been there remembered with clarity. Only they carried the weight of what she had done. And perhaps that was enough. One evening, walking home through the city, Elizabeth passed a small cafe. Inside, a television played muted news footage of disasters elsewhere. Earthquakes, storms, fires. People watched, shaking their heads, murmuring about the helplessness of it all. Elizabeth paused at the window. Her reflection stared back. The same quiet woman, hair tucked behind her ears, eyes thoughtful. She wondered how many invisible nightingales sat in those disaster zones, waiting for the moment when calm would matter more than anything else. She kept walking. At home, she placed another letter into the drawer where she kept them all. She read it once more before closing it away. It was from a passenger she barely remembered, a man who had been near the rear. His handwriting was shaky, uneven, but the words were clear. "Sometimes the strongest person is the one no one notices. Until the world begins to fall apart." You reminded me of that. Thank you. Elizabeth closed the drawer and sat in the quiet. She let the silence wash over her. Not the silence of being unseen, but the silence of having acted when it mattered most. She thought of the cabin, the smoke, the trembling hands clutching seatbelts, the voices waiting for someone to tell them it would be okay. She thought of the word that had once been a burden, a secret name she had buried in shame. Nightingale. She whispered it to herself, not as a code, not as a command, but as a reminder that dignity doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't shout or posture. It doesn't need applause. It simply acts. And that, she realized, was enough.